Hello, I'm Adam Grimes, and welcome to Module 2, Unit 1 of the Art and Science of Trading, Pivots and Swings, which together are the building blocks of market structure. So this is a continuation of where we ended last time. Just a very quick review. We did a lot of work with chart stories. We're going to do some more work with that. Most of our attention is going to turn to bigger structures now. But just to touch on chart stories again, this was where we were looking at the details of every bar. And I believe in the previous module that I adequately qualified the limitations of this approach and just how difficult it is to make good use of this chart story information in a look-forward context. We also talked about higher time frames are probably more significant. That's going to become even more important today. And here's a point from the last module that might not have been emphasized enough. We're certainly going to talk about it now. The high and low of every bar is potential short-term support and resistance. We're going to put that to use in a structural element. Just again, still very quickly reviewing here. So what was important when we were looking at chart stories? Well, one thing that's very important is the position of the open and the close. So you have here a bar with the open here and the close here within the day's range. Compare that situation to something like this, where you have here a bar that's probably dynamic, and here you have a bar that probably chopped around. Also, we looked at the range relative to previous bars. If you see a situation where you have a lot of small bars and then a lot of big bars, obviously a big bar is probably significant or worthy of your attention. I talked a little bit about visible support and resistance levels. We're going to talk a lot more about that in this module. And we sort of left things with the broad idea of thinking about each bar in context of recent data as well. Well, let's do that a little bit more formally and talk about pivot points. So language is a little bit difficult. People use this word in many contexts and to mean many things, but specifically when I say pivot or pivot point, I mean this type of formation. So you have a bar where the high is higher than the previous and the following high. Or you have a low, this is a pivot high. This bar then is a pivot high. Or you have a bar where the low is lower than the previous low and also lower than the following low. So this indicates some type of short-term exhaustion of buying and selling pressure. And these are important points to watch for potential support and resistance. Now, people will use pivots to mean lots of things, like calculated levels. There are these S1, S2, R3 pivots that are calculated, Murray math, Camarilla pivots, Fibonacci. There's a lot of calculations. That is not what we're talking about, just to be clear. When I say pivot, I mean this formation that we're looking at in the patterns on the chart. Other words that I may use, I may say pivot high, pivot low. I may say pivot point. I may simply say pivot. All the same thing. These will then grow to be swings. We may also call pivot highs and lows market structure highs and lows. You'll see that. I probably don't use that terminology. You'll see it in some of the other literature. Also quite imprecise, but short-term highs and lows is another thing that people will talk about. But just keep in mind, what we're looking for here is a high that's above the previous and the following high, and a low that is lower than the previous and the following low. That's a pivot or a pivot point. So why do we need this? Well, look at this chart. What's the structure here? What's going on with this chart? Let's answer this in a few ways. So one thing we might say is it's going up and then it was going down, right? That's obvious. Or wait, is there more? Was it going up and then down and then up and then down, something like that? Or was it going up and down? Like the question is really, how many of these, I just created one that wasn't there, how many of these little jags and little moves do we capture? There are a lot of different ways you could do it, and I think basically everything that I just outlined is a possible answer, but I want to give you an objective structure that will help to answer that. So first thing we do is we look at pivot highs and lows, and here is a chart with every single pivot high outlined with a blue dot and every single pivot low outlined with a red dot. Now, the first thing you'll notice, there are a lot of these, right? These by themselves sometimes, of course, They occur at very significant points. Look at this. Here's a very important pivot high. Here, I guess, is an important pivot low, maybe an important high here. So we can highlight the fact that these do appear at important points, but also how important are these guys, right? It's a very common formation that we need to filter and look at in some different ways. But regardless, and this is going to be part of your homework, is creating this type of pivot, basically marking all of the pivots. Now, I do want to say something that is important. So you're going to do this a little bit in your homework, and we're going to spend some time doing very structured work here. This will not be your future in trading. So in other words, if you're going to be a discretionary chart reader, which is really what we're focusing on here, you're not going to go through and mark all of these pivot points. This is a training tool, but it is a valuable training tool, but it's just a training tool for teaching your eye to see the structure, for teaching you to understand the structure that's on the chart. So is it worth doing and spending time? Absolutely. It's why it's up here front and center very early in the trading course. It's an important exercise, but don't get the idea that this is something that you are going to continue doing, months down the road while you're trading. This is just a way to understand the structure with the flow of market data, basically. So those are pivots. Swings happen when we put bars together. Each bar has a story. Yes, we know that. The bar is the smallest unit on the price chart. We know there's stuff inside the bar that we can't necessarily see, but we can make some very intelligent guesses about. We start putting these bars together. We start to see some other things. We've done that in chart stories, but swings really tell us what's going on with the stock. And creating swings is very easy. What I have done here is I've simply connected every high and low, and I've ghosted the price bars. It's faded out a little bit just to highlight the swing structure. But you can see here, all I have done is taken the low that created the low up to the high. There are a few refinements here. So here's a low and here's a lower low. You also, there's a little bit of discretion. You may wish to connect from there, but if you have a number of highs and lows in a row, which you will have, like here are multiple highs, generally speaking, you would probably want to take the highest one of those. You want to be consistent, but if it alternates as it does here, then it's very simple. You just take high, low, high, low. Let me erase that so you can have a good look at the structure here. And here's just a very simple illustration of when you have these type of clusters of lows or highs, and the colors are switched here, which I assume you can see very easily, then you take the most extreme. There might be some cases when you would want to do things a little bit differently, but that should be kind of your basic mode of operation. So those are simple pivots. Not a hard situation to understand, a hard structure to understand. But one thing, actually, let me go back here because there is a point. This is backward looking also. So, that was my complaint with the chart stories, is that it was good as an explanatory context. It was harder to use looking forward. So again, you're going to be creating some great structure here, but you need to know. Let's take a very obvious one. Let's take this one. So here is a pivot low at an important turning point, but you did not know this was a pivot low until this bar was complete, until the next bar was complete. That's obvious. Many of you have already thought of that if we're looking for, just imagine these bars are forming. So this bar forms here. So the question is this previous bar a pivot low? Well, if this bar goes lower, then no, it's not, right? Here, the next bar opens. Do we have a pivot low? Well, it comes down and trades the same or a little bit lower. No, it's not. We don't know until this bar is completed, and then, of course, subsequent bars that we put in a pivot low. So that's important here. You would have figured it out very quickly if you haven't already. It becomes even more important when we start talking about these higher order pivots and swings. So all this concept does, a second order pivot, which we can also call an intermediate term pivot, is a pivot that is surrounded by a previous pivot. So in other words, I'll just use dots here. Let's say this is a pivot high, and this is a pivot high, and this is a pivot high. So because this is an intermediate term, this is a pivot that is surrounded by two lower pivot highs, this then becomes an intermediate term, or we can use the word second order I used in the book, pivot high. And of course, what do you think a third order is? It's this structure. We would highlight all of the second order pivots, and it would be a pivot that was surrounded by second order pivots lower. Obviously, the same thing would apply to pivot lows. So this starts to drive us toward very high level market structure. And I've highlighted the second order pivots here with double dots. They may not jump out, but you'll see the same thing. Like these start to cluster at, it will eliminate a lot of this stuff. We looked at this pattern here specifically and said, well, there's a lot of pivot highs, but then when we start pulling out the important ones, we'll start to see that more and more of these second order pivots really do define, I'll come back to that one, really do define some fairly significant turning points in the stock or currency or whatever we're looking at. Of course, okay, I suppose this is one, but you will still have some issues which require a little bit of finesse and a little bit of thinking about. Here are two that probably aren't extremely important. Again, let me clear my marks just so you can see these. So what do you think happens when we connect the intermediate term pivots? We get intermediate term swings. So you connect your simple pivots, you get swings. You connect your intermediate term pivots, you get intermediate term swings. I bet you can figure out if we connect the longer term pivots, what you get, right? And the longer term pivots are, you would take these second order pivots. So I don't think you can see on this chart, but I believe that this price, this high is lower than this high. So, not a crystal clear example, but because we have a lower and a lower pivot high, this would be a second order pivot high. This would be, I believe this is lower. So this would, I said second order, I'm sorry. This would be a third order. So I'm kind of going through and highlighting the third orders here. So that is the way you would do that. It just kind of builds up from these swings. Market structure and price action. These are words that we throw around, but they're very important. And in fact, I use it as a subtitle for my book. What's the difference? Market structure is static. It shows the impact of supply and demand on longer time frames, and critically, it's visible as pivots and swings. That's what we're defining here. When we define these swings, we're really defining the market structure. By comparison, everything I just said about market structure, the opposite is true of price action. Static, price action is dynamic. Price action many times is the result of what's going on lower time frames. Lower time frames as opposed to higher or longer time frames for market structure. A lot of times we kind of have to infer or guess at what's going on in the price action if we're looking at a finished chart. It can be harder to see on a chart. While the market structure changes slowly, price action changes pretty quickly. And I came up with this metaphor in the book, which is if you can imagine a finger writing a line in the sand, the line that the finger leaves is the market structure, where the price has been. The way the finger makes that line, is it pressing hard? Is it pressing lightly? Is it jerky, or is it clean? How fast is it moving? That's the price action, which, if you look at the trace in the sand, you could probably make some pretty good guesses, but you might not necessarily know. This is not just theoretical stuff. This, when we start to think about putting trading systems together and about really understanding what's going on in the market, this is a foundational core concept. It's very important. So why do we care about all of this? Well, swing analysis is one tool that can show us critically who is in control of the market and what's their conviction level doing. Are the bulls, the people that want the market to go up, are they in control, and are they getting more or less confident? Every edge we have as technical traders comes from an imbalance of buying and selling pressure. Now, there may be other kinds of trading where it's not necessarily driven by this imbalance, but I do believe that if we're going to see a departure from random movement, which is something we're going to talk about it in subsequent units here in this module, it's going to be an important idea. We're going to see that imbalance, that we're going to see some departure from random movement, pretty much has to be driven by an imbalance. And the market structure can help to reveal that. It's very important to consider the length of each swing against previous swings, both in time and price. That's a concept that we're going to continue to build out. So just start thinking about that this week. Quick review here. Concept of a pivot is very simple. Something most of you who have looked at charts have seen this, but maybe you didn't realize that it was so important. This is a tool to train your eye to see the structure. Eventually, you'll be very, very fast at outlining the structure and seeing it. I do think initially, though, to get there, it's worth your time spending some time marking these on charts. Keep in mind, though, this is not your future as a trader. This is just a training tool. And then we have built swings by connecting pivots. And to this list, I probably should add the concept of a second order or intermediate term pivot and a third order or long-term pivot. I think that's probably necessary to round it out. So that is a pretty good start here, and I will see you back for the next unit. Thank you.